We're all good. So my name is Sean Markin, and I'm an independent AGI researcher. I'm not going to bore you with my bio, but if you want to check out my work, you can visit BasicAI.org. The reason I'm organizing this seminar is that I'm a big believer in AGI, and I think it's possible. I think it's possible that it could happen in most of our lifetimes, and I think it would be, at least potentially, be a very good thing. But I also think that AGI research is not making a whole lot of progress, and there's not even a whole lot of discussion about it. So my hope with this seminar is to provoke some more discussion, maybe some more enthusiasm around AGI, and hopefully spread these ideas a bit further. So the plan for today is, first of all, I'm going to do a general overview of what AGI is, or at least what it is to me, just to hopefully set the stage. And then we can have some discussion, whatever, however long people want to just chat, we can do that. And then depending on what kind of time we have left over, I'm going to talk about some of the work of Doug Hofstadter, who is, he's a cognitive scientist, and some of you may know his work because he wrote a book, Code Bach, that became quite popular. I am recording this seminar, so if you don't want to be on the recording for whatever reason, just email me afterwards. Let's see. And if anybody has questions, you should just feel free to interrupt, or has comments, whatever. So, overview of AGI. The first question, I think, is what is AGI? And the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think different people will give different answers. So my answer is that an AGI is basically a computer that thinks like a person, and ideally should be able to do all the same kind of intellectual tasks that a person can do. And ideally would like them to be done to the same level of quality as a person and with the same minimal level of training. Certainly we don't go in and reprogram our brains to do a new task, and so we don't want to do that with AGI either. AGI versus AI, they're two very different things, and I think that's a lot of the confusion about AGI stems from thinking of AGI in terms of AI and vice versa, but they're really very different. In AI, we want to solve particular tasks usually. AGI is the goal of solving everything. In AI, there's the methodology is that whatever works to solve your particular task, that's fine. But in AGI, we usually hope to find a way to solve a problem that will generalize to other things. And one way of achieving that is to look at solutions to problems that seem to resemble what humans do. And then, of course, there's various other differences. In AI, one of the key factors is this idea of function approximation. And that's, a lot of AI systems can be described in those terms, where you're trying to do some kind of prediction from a bunch of input features. And that, I would say, probably does not play as big a role in AGI, but what you do see in AGI is a bit more of effort to build cognitive models. So then there's sort of the various big questions about AGI. So how close are we to solving AGI? How can it be solved? And of course, there's some degree of controversy about these things, but I'll give you my take. So in terms of how close we are, I think that this is sort of very hard to answer. And I think it's going to depend a lot on how much work goes into AGI. I also think that if the amount of work going into AGI kind of remains constant where it is now, we're probably not going to see AGI in our lifetimes. I think there's just not enough happening. As for the second question of how do you attack AGI, this is even more controversial, but I'll give you my opinion. So I think a good way to approach that question is to ask, what are the things that humans are good at that computers still can't do? And I might try to divide these into kind of three categories. So the first one is just sensor motor abilities, where things, So we have some ability to get computers to do, say, object recognition, but the abilities of humans are still way beyond computers. And this is basically the reason why we don't have, say, domestic robots. We just don't know how to build sufficiently good vision systems or motor systems. So that's one thing. A second reason why we don't have human-like performance in AI systems is the common sense problem. And common sense just means knowledge about the world. So this could be a variety of things. It could mean things like being able to carry on a natural conversation. It could mean knowing things about abstract concepts like what is a mortgage, or what is a cloud, what is an institution. And there's just so much information about the world that it's basically impossible to type it all in into a computer. The only project that's really attempted something like that is Psych, and it hasn't really even scratched the surface of how much knowledge we have. So there's a big bottleneck with acquiring common sense knowledge and even knowing how to represent it. And so that poses a big challenge as well. So many tasks that you naturally think of as humans doing will have either a major sensory motor component or a major common sense component. And for that reason, we're sort of stuck on those in terms of getting computers to do them. But there's still a third category that I would add, which is that even if you take away the sensory motor aspects of tasks and the common sense aspects, there's still a lot of tasks that computers can't do. And kind of the prime example of a task like this might be something like mathematical research, where there's no real necessity to be able to perceive the world, and there's not a lot of common sense knowledge involved, just knowledge of math, but we still don't have automated mathematicians, at least not in anything resembling what human mathematicians do. And along similar lines, we don't have computer systems that can kind of do AI work, where they would, say, take a bunch of images of letters and try to work out what is it about these images that makes this one an A or this one a B. So those are kind of the three factors that make tasks difficult. And then we can ask the question of how might we get around those problems. So first, I would say that I think the common sense issue is somewhat blocked on the sensory motor issue, in that one of the main ways that people acquire knowledge about the world is obviously through our senses. So if we try to figure out what is it that we know about, like what is a door, for example, well, nobody really ever gave us a definition of a door, most likely. They just pointed and said, that's a door. And we saw several doors or many doors, and eventually we figured out what they all had in common. And so to do that kind of automated knowledge acquisition would require a sensory motor system. And so there's that kind of dependency there. And then in turn, I think that sensory motor systems may actually be blocked on intellectual tasks. And this is my viewpoint, but it is an unusual one, and that many people will have the view that we should start AGI by trying to build a sensory motor system and then kind of build on top of that. I think that may actually be the wrong way to go about it, because it's just so difficult to build sensory motor systems that are anywhere near the quality of humans. And it's not clear that we need to do that, because conceivably, if you had an AI which could at least do some basic reasoning, sort of scientific style reasoning, conceivably it could build its own vision system. And so I think that if you could get a system that was good at that kind of intellectual task, then that may give it the ability to make progress in the sensory motor issue itself. And then in turn, that would help solve the common sense problem. So I think that's one possibility for how you might go about attacking AGI. But of course, other people are going to have other opinions. Let's see. So then the next question that I think people will often ask about AGI is what's the relevant background, or where should we be looking for information that might help us? And so here's my list. One thing that I actually don't think is terribly useful, or at least not central, is deep learning neural networks. There's a lot of recent buzz and hype around these techniques because they've allowed us to do some new tasks that we haven't been able to do before. But it's not clear to me that these actually are going to help in any major way with AGI. And I can answer questions about that if people are curious. But that's one thing that I would not put on the list. The main things that I would put on the list, as you can see, are sort of classical AI, especially the parts involving reasoning, various pieces of cognitive science, and linguistics, because language is the manifestation of thought, and thought seems to be one of the central things about intelligence that we haven't been able to model very well. And then finally, I would put neuroscience in the list. And then briefly, I'll just mention some of the groups that often get associated with AGI, whether because they're sort of explicitly working on AGI or because they have kind of a reputation for an interest in AGI or some kind of relevance to AGI. So here's a list of some of the major organizations. Some of these, I think, are the association with AGI is a bit more either marketing or sort of something they aspire to do in the long term, but not necessarily in the short term. So I think that's true of OpenAI and DeepMind, who are really working a lot on neural nets and deep learning. But it's not clear that that's the path to AGI, even if that's one of their sort of long-term goals. And then you've got a couple of organizations like Numenta and Vicarious who are working on approaches to AI which are really heavily influenced by neurobiology. Again, just in my opinion, I'm not convinced that that's the path to AGI either. I think because that's a very low level of abstraction. It's sort of like trying to understand computers by looking at semiconductor physics. I'm not convinced that's the way to go, even though I think that could have a contributing role to play. And then I listed a couple other projects there that if you haven't heard of them, you may be interested in checking out. So that's the end of what I was going to say just in terms of general introduction. So I'd like to kind of invite everybody to introduce yourself, maybe say a bit about your background, what you're interested in, ask questions, debate. So yeah, just feel free to jump in. And thanks. I appreciate the comment from Nick. We have a really small group, so I think it might make sense for people to just kind of introduce themselves. Okay, so that's an interesting question. Tommy asked about whether AGI requires quantum computers, perhaps, or something even beyond that. I personally do think it's possible with classical computers. just because I don't really see, or I don't see a strong argument to the contrary why it would require something more complicated. And I think there's a couple other arguments for that. One of them is that there's a lot of things that we can do now with just an ordinary classical computer that are, at least in some sense, sort of a precursor to human thinking. So for example, we have systems that can do some forms of mathematical reasoning or theorem proving, and those things certainly resemble thought. We have, I'm going to talk about later, some systems that do what you might think of as perception. And we have all kinds of AI systems, of course, that do different types of perception. And all of these systems are implemented with classical computers. So it's not clear why we wouldn't be able to go further with classical computers. The other thing I would say about that topic is that the brain certainly seems to be a classical system. It's not clear that quantum effects play a substantial role in the mechanisms of the brain. And so that would be another reason to expect that a classical computer is good enough for AGI. So hi, Nick. Glad to have you. Yep, I definitely see a lot of people are into deep learning. Anybody else want to jump in with an introduction? If you do decide to jump in, you should feel free to do so later. You can interrupt me if you wish. Okay, so I see Zach is doing AI safety research. That also seems to be a hot topic these days. And I think that's a really important goal in AI safety research is exactly what you say of trying to figure out what an AGI would actually be like. I'm personally somewhat skeptical of the kind of AI safety research that happens today. And the reason I'm skeptical, or at least part of the reason, is that it seems like a lot of that research is proceeding without trying to answer the question of what an AGI would actually be like. So yeah, I think that's a really good thing to do, to ask that question. And then Ben asked, so I'm assuming that was directed to me about BasicAI. So the goal of BasicAI is simply to do the long-term research that I think is important to make progress on AGI. And ultimately, of course, we'd like to see that done in a way that is beneficial for everybody and not just captured by a few corporations, say. One of the things that makes BasicAI different is our approach to AI. And there's a couple elements to that. So one of them is that I'm a big believer in trying to look at how human cognition works and trying to model that. And another aspect is I think that the right level of abstraction to look at intelligence is sort of the level on which thought happens. So where you're looking at things like symbols or language, semantics, syntax. And it seems to me that that's sort of the level we actually have a lot of data on, in the sense that you can take a look at your own thought process and report what's happening in your own mind, but you can only do that in the sense that you can kind of report a sequence of thoughts and how your train of thought is unfolding. But of course, you can't report anything at a lower level, like which neurons are firing. And so for that reason, we have so much data, or at least we can gather easily data about trains of thought. And I think that makes that a good target for investigation. So our approach in general is to try to pick appropriate tasks where people are doing some kind of intellectual thinking task that's not impossibly difficult, but also not trivial. And then to try to analyze those tasks by just looking at how humans seem to behave and then building models of that. Yes, I agree with Tommy that this is the most exciting goal. I think this is sort of the final frontier of science. In that I mean, if you look at physics, for example, physics is largely understood in the sense that it's kind of hard to do an experiment that generates that gives us evidence that there's some kind of new physics we haven't understood. But in AGI, we really have no idea how to make it happen, or how human intelligence works. So I would certainly agree with that. As for this question of what's the next step, at least for me, you can kind of, if you're interested in that question, you can go on our website, BasicAI.org, and you can look at some of our documents, and we try to explain in somewhat more detail some of the things we're working on and what the logical next steps would be. Yeah, Nick makes a good point. That's kind of, I agree with that. I think that's a good argument for why classical computers are probably sufficient for AGI. Hi, Austin. Thanks for introducing yourself. Out of curiosity, which AGI startup are you in? So in terms of this question of what other projects would I recommend looking at, I have a reading list. Let me find the URL for that. So if you go to that PDF, you can see some of the things that I think are particularly relevant. And there's quite a few of them, but some of them may be somewhat unconventional. So I would definitely recommend checking that list out. In terms of kind of existing organizations or existing projects that are sort of actively being developed and also explicitly aiming at AGI, I'm not sure there are that many that I'm super enthusiastic about. I think that many of them are doing some interesting things, but I'm not convinced that anybody has really found the right path yet. Yeah, I think that that's certainly true regarding neural nets. They, I guess there was kind of neural nets have kind of gone in and out of popularity over time, and before Hinton's work on deep learning, I think that people weren't really expecting neural nets to make that kind of comeback and prove their worth on new problems in the way that they did. So yeah, there's something to be said for unconventional approaches. The conventional wisdom is not always right. Okay, I think I'm going to go on to the other thing I was planning to talk about, which is some of Doug Hofstadter's work. So let me do that. So just as an overview, Doug Hofstadter is a cognitive scientist, and he's at the University of Indiana. And he's been around a while, so I think he may be close to retiring at this point. But you may know him as the author of Go to Löscherbach, which was a popular book from 1979. And I think it was like the top of the bestseller list or something. So most people, if they've heard of him, that's probably how. But in addition to that, he's also done a lot of work on trying to build models of human-like cognition. And this is interesting to me because, first of all, I think it's relevant to AGI, and also because it's fairly unusual research in that there's just not very much else out there like it. So one of the things that Hofstadter is really focused on is this various types of puzzles, and especially kind of like analogy puzzles. So one example of that is sequence extrapolation, where you start with the sequence and then you just try to say like what comes after that. So, oops. So for example, in this sequence 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, 4, that's a relatively easy one. And of course, you're probably expecting after that 5, 5, 5s would be the next thing. A somewhat harder example would be the one below it. And if you stare at that for a second, I don't know if this is the only answer, but at least a good answer would be that the next thing, actually, maybe I'll type it in the chat box. So if you were to take that sequence there and analyze it by forming groups like this, then you can see a natural pattern emerge. And then the logical extension at that point would be like 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, 4. So this is kind of a simple intellectual task in that it involves some kind of thinking, whatever we want to call that. But it doesn't really have any kind of prerequisites in terms of sensory motor ability or knowledge about the world. A second type of task that he's looked at quite a bit is these analogy problems that involve sequences of letters. So, for example, you could ask the question of if the sequence AABC goes to AABD, then what would you convert IJKK to if it was supposed to be analogous? Anybody wants to propose their answer, feel free to type it. And I think there's more than one good answer there. And Hofstadter makes that same point. So often in these problems, there's a certain element of creativity that can be applied, or at least there's no single right answer. So there's a certain amount of subjectivity. But so one good answer would be to say like maybe IJLL, because KK can be seen as analogous to C, and then you're converting that to the next letter. Another answer you might propose is to kind of view the analogy in a different way and say that in AABC you're reading forwards, and in KKJI you're reading backwards, so that AA corresponds to KK. And if you view it that way, then maybe the natural extension or the natural result of the analogy would be HJKK, where you modify the last thing that you encounter. So that's an example of that type of problem. And one other problem that, or one other class of problem that I will let you explore on your own if you're curious is what are called Vanguard problems. And these are sort of like problems you might see on an IQ test, although they're not exactly the same. And all three of these types of problems have been focuses of his research and the research of his students as well. So all these problems are approachable, but they're also non-trivial, and so that, I think, makes them potentially interesting. All right, so just kind of as an overview of what Hofstadter has done, there's been quite a few systems, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 systems, most of which have corresponded to a PhD thesis by one of his students. And some of these systems are not all that well explained in the theses, and they just don't give sufficient detail about the mechanisms to be able to fully reconstruct how they work. But one of the ones that does give a lot of detail is Copycat, and so I'm going to give a bit more depth on that. Copycat was a system that's quite old now. I think it was like 80s, and it was aimed at these letter analogy problems. So I'm going to try to do an overview of how that system worked. And for that, let me pull up a whiteboard. So just bear with me for a minute. All right, so I'm hoping that this worked and people can actually see the whiteboard. Or maybe it stopped working. Let me try that one more time. Can people see the whiteboard? Or maybe, let me know if you cannot see the whiteboard. So let's look at an example problem. And sorry for the delay, I just have a lot of windows open. All right, so here's a sample problem. If ABC maps to ABD, then what does II, JJ, JK map to? So the way a problem like this was solved is, first of all, Copycat would identify the rule that seems to apply within the first correspondence. In other words, how do you get from ABC to ABD? And Copycat actually was quite restrictive about what kind of changes were allowed there. That's a restriction that was relaxed in later work. But at least in Copycat, it only allowed changes of a single letter, so from C to D, for example. And its way of describing that was basically to say, you have some way of describing the letter that changes, which could be either saying like the letter C itself changes, or you could say the rightmost letter changes, and both of those interpretations are possible. And then you could say either that it changes to D literally, or you could say that it changes to whatever comes after it, the successor. So Copycat would basically, at random, choose which interpretation to use there of how the string is being changed. So that was the first step. And that's basically the easy part. The next part was to build an analogy between the two left-hand sides. So you want some kind of analogy between this string here and this string here. And that's achieved by a sort of bottom-up perceptual process where the first thing that it does is form groups of letters. So for example, the II would probably get grouped because those two match, and the JJ would get grouped, and the KK would get grouped. And then once you've formed appropriate groups, you can form a larger group around the entire string and say, for example, that this whole string seems to constitute what they're calling a successor group. I think that's what they called it. And the reason for calling it a successor group is that as you move across the group from the first thing to the second thing, etc., the letter category is increasing or moving to the successor each time. So the bottom part can be seen as a successor group, and the top can also be seen as a successor group. And because you framed both strings in the same way, you can say that an analogy has been built. So analogies usually involve some kind of framing of two different situations as the same thing. And they also always involve some kind of mapping of features. So in this case, some of the things that are being mapped is like the A is being mapped to the II and B is mapped to the JJ. And more abstractly, we can say that the analogy that's been built here is that individual letters have been mapped to groups, because in the first successor group, the elements were letters, but in the second one, they were themselves groups. So this is one possible type of non-trivial mapping. There's also sort of the trivial thing you can say about these groups, which is that like in the first one, where we're reading left to right. So we're reading right words. And in the second group, we were also reading left to right. So the idea of rightwardsness has been mapped to itself, which is not terribly interesting. But in different analogy problems, that could have been different. So now that this analogy has been established, what happens is that the mappings involved in the analogy are applied to the rule. So the rule that was built here would have been something like, let's just say that we change the rightmost letter to its successor. And then what happens is you basically take this rule here, and whatever substitutions occurred in the analogy on the left-hand side, those will also be applied to the rule itself. So the main change was this one here, where the word letter, or the concept of letters, gets changed to the concept of groups. And so if you were to apply that here, what you end up with is a rule that says, or what they call a translated rule, and now it says change the rightmost group. To its successor. And so based on that, you get II, JJ, LL. And that's how that happens. So I think I'll show you one more example where, let's look at, we'll still do ABC goes to ABD, but then you could ask the question of what does KJI go to? And in this case, one way of building the analogy this time would be to say that instead of reading from left to right, we read right to left. And so the concept of rightness has been converted to the concept of leftness. And so if you apply that to the rule, then you end up with a rule that says change the leftmost letter to its successor instead of changing the rightmost letter. And so based on that analogy, you would end up with LJI. So and they go through several of these analogy problems, but this is basically the gist of how it works. And so I think this tells us at least something about how analogy seems to work in people's minds, and maybe how different types of structures are built up. Let me go back to the presentation for a second, just to say a few words about the architecture of this system. So let me just see if I can get the sharing back on that window. So in general, the strategy they used here was what's called a blackboard architecture, where there's a workspace that contains the current state of processing, or the current state of analysis of the problem. And so at any given time on the blackboard, you'd have things like what groups have been formed, like what groups of letters, what correspondences does the system believe exist. So for example, does A map to KK, or does B map to JJ, things like that. And then the action that happens in the system is a combination of a lot of different processes, some of which build up new structures. For example, they build new groups or new correspondences or new theories about what the mapping should be. And then other processes which are also happening at the same time in a kind of non-deterministic parallel way delete some of the structures that have been built. And so you have the construction and the deletion happening over time, where there's a bias towards keeping around structures that seem to be more logical or make more sense. And then they use what's called simulated annealing, or at least that's the typical term for this, where at the early stages of processing, the system is willing to kind of do anything to create any correspondence or delete anything. And then over time, it becomes increasingly biased to keep around quote unquote good structures and avoid deleting them. And that kind of process tends to be a good way of optimizing, um, optimizing to find like a structure that fits your goals the best. So that you might interpret that as finding the best analogy between two strings. And so that's kind of, there's a lot more to it that you can read about if you're curious, but that's the general idea. And that structure has been applied across many different projects, not just to this letter of knowledge type of problem. So if you're curious, details about this, there's a book called Analogy Making as Perception that was written by one of Hofstadter's students, the one who created Copycat. And I would also recommend looking at the thesis about what's called Metacat, which was the successor project to Copycat, and added some additional capabilities to it. So I think that's about all I had. So again, everyone should feel free to just jump in with questions or comments, or feel free to mention things you'd like to see discussed in the future, or just any other questions you have. I see people have been using the text chat, but you're all more than welcome to jump in with the mic. In terms of future presentations, I think I'll try to set up some kind of sort of poll just to see what people are interested in hearing about. And I'm also interested in hearing from some of you. If you're interested in doing a presentation, that would be awesome. And if you are, just email me and tell me like what you want to talk about, how long you think your presentation would run. Any amount of time is fine. And what dates you might want to present on. I'm going to type my email address into the chat box in case you want to reach me. Thanks. Yep, I definitely recommend reading Hofstadter's work. There's a lot of it. I'll mention some of the other books he's written. So there's a book called, and I'll type this as well, Fluid Concepts and Creative Analogies. And that kind of overviews a lot of the different work that he and his students have done. And I guess I'll mention some of the other projects. So there was a project called Sequence, and then Sexy. These were both about the sequence domain. There was Copycat and Metacat that we talked about. There was Letter Spirit, which I didn't even mention that at all, but that's about essentially visual perception and fonts. And there was the Vanguard problems, and that was the name of the system for that one was called FICO. So you can, any of those things you can Google and learn more if you're curious. Other comments, questions, anything? So if there's, yep, I'm definitely hoping to make this recurring. Originally, I was even thinking of doing it weekly, although I think maybe not quite so often would make more sense. So I'll get back to you about that. So if there's no other comments or questions, I think we can call it a day. If you want to stick around, feel free to do that. I'll be around for a little while. You can chat or ask questions or whatever you like. But thanks everybody for coming.